Gaming magazines. So I never read these as a kid. I didn't have magazines. I had this thing that you called the internet. You might have heard of it. You might be using it right now. But if I wanted to find out anything about games, I would just go online, look it up. Through my teenage years, I would log into websites like Eurogamer, PC Gamer, Rock Paper Shotgun, Kotaku, and get anything interesting that I wanted about games. Previews of upcoming releases, reviews of existing ones, you get the deal. I have to say, I found a lot of those websites have declined in quality. It's unfortunate, and then I realised, well, I make money. I can just go out and buy stuff. And it was from a wee impulse purchase of, because it has Outrun on the cover, and I just like the game. It was really as simple as that. Had a wee peruse through, and I thought, you know what, actually, I want to read more of these. So I subscribed to a number of them. I've been reading them for about a year. And the question is, how is it as a replacement to just getting everything online? This is probably the relevant one to start with, because PC Gamer has a website. Biggest question here is, why would you use the physical paid magazine if you can just go there? Well, I have to be honest, I don't really like the website. The quality of writing in here and the curation is far superior. You go onto the PC Gamer website, half of it is guides. You go onto some other websites and it's all, so-and-so said this thing on Twitter, and that's the entirety of the article. This is a much better experience. So what's inside? Well, you've got previews of upcoming games, your sort of covered feature, which isn't that game. Oops. It is. It's right here. Some nice art. Your review portion, and here everything that's come out recently gets a score, gets a discussion about it, a hardware section, and then this hardware section, it can be different things each month, and then your sort of generalist area. So this is talking about games that get updates, there's a game guide section. Now let's talk about how that works. PC Gamer has some good writing in it. So here's this review of this game. Billionaire, never heard of it, right? But now I remember it. In 2007, a game called Peggle was released. In 2008, the world suffered a global economic crisis. To this day, I refuse to believe these two facts were unrelated. The only agency you had was the direction you fired the ball in. Once you finally accepted that, the spell would hopefully break, and you could finally uninstall the bloody thing. It's just written in such an entertaining way that you understand the experience here. I wouldn't have cared about this game otherwise. Now about this one. Alright, so this review of Sniper Elite Resistance, this one was really entertaining. There's only one major problem: new hero Harry Hawker. I've always thought of Carl Fairbairn, star of the main series, as a human-shaped blob of porridge. Compared to Hawker ever, Fairbairn is George Clooney. He feels like an awkward children's TV presenter, constantly chipping in to tell me that long grass is itchy but good to hide in, or suggesting I might get spotted if I go this way. I think I might hate Harry Hawker. There's a care to this, there's an effort in the writing. This isn't your typical press release copy-pasted into an article. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth gave me the world's most luxurious vacation. I was shuffled like a hurried tourist from one dazzling experience to the next. But the indoor kid in me must be too strong, because it didn't take long before I was tired of all the sights and sounds and just wanted to go home. Here you've got how many pages? Like somewhere around 100, right? And it has to fit. That's your month's issue. Anything important goes in there. You do have a guide section, and I have to say, I skip it because I don't care. That's what the internet's for. The good news is, the guide is that. So I just reach this point and I go, nah. There's plenty of websites online that descend into simple reposts of Twitter because, well, it's got to keep rolling. You've got to be new, you've got to be on the scene the moment it happens. Otherwise, you lose it all to social media. Here they can take their time, and it shows. I can read about this game in Zoy, didn't know about it. It sounds really interesting. Maybe not for me, but a lot of the things they're going for make it sound like an interesting match for The Sims, right? Brilliant. Cool. That's on my radar now. I think they do a really, really good job with the previews. I think there's a lot of time dedicated to a lot of different games, smaller releases, get these smaller segments, and you tend to have a cover feature. In this case it was Sid Meier's Civilization 7. And they talk to developers, you know, they get insight, they ask about what they're going for, what the goals of development are, what they hope players get out of it, and all of this stuff means that when the game comes out, you get a much stronger appreciation of everything that's gone into it, whether the game is successful or not. I love this. This is great. This feels like the kind of thing you occasionally get on an internet article, and then everyone in the comments says, oh, they don't write it like this anymore, except it turns out they do. It's here, right? Brilliant. The reviews, PC Gamer does a pretty good job. A lot of detail, a lot of things that are relevant to you if you're playing the game, right? So this is Flight Sim, and it's talking a lot about stuff that I have no earthly comprehension of because I don't understand flight simulators. But this, here we go. Okay, this is my kind of thing. I mean, there's Infinite, there you go. You're doing good, lad. There's a broad variety, though. This Ant strategy game, looks really cool. Looks silly. It's a great way of broadening horizons, right? There's so many games out there, and my time is more limited now than the money to buy the game, you know? The other thing that's nice here is that they understand the technology. I mean, they have a whole hardware section, right? So it makes sense that when they're reviewing games, there's discussion here about the hardware that they ran on and what the expectations would be and whether the game is well optimized given that. It feels like this is the kind of thing that I would see a thread about on social media. And there'd be some dismissive one-line comments because nobody reads the article. But actually, just sitting down with this and getting to go through it, it gives me a much clearer picture of what's coming up. My one criticism, and it's a small one, is that this style of writing isn't exactly revolutionary. This won't change your perspective on the way things can be written forever. This is just a really solid version of what you already know. And that's okay. I like it. The only bit that I don't really like is the guides because, well, I haven't played this game, and if I was stuck, I'd just go online. And admittedly, the diary sounds fun. Sometimes I read these if it's a quirky game like this, but if it's a multi-parter in an RPG, I usually give it a skip. But we're talking a tiny proportion there of this whole magazine. I've had a pretty good experience with it. That's PC Gamer. So here's the one that started it all, Retro Gamer. Their gimmick is, they only cover stuff predating, I believe it's 2007. Interestingly, they actually have a segment at the beginning of the magazine that is dated roughly around the same time, where they talk about the new releases. The games that came out, the reviews of them at the time, you get a good idea of just how different things were then. But also some world news and some silly stuff like what was in the charts like that month. And so all of this is through the lens of nostalgia. It's Outrun 2, it's the PSP, it's the 90s, I guess, as a concept. It's Nintendo hardware. Crash Bandicoot. Oh, there he is again. Great stuff. But well, I don't remember most of this. I remember some of it, but I wasn't exactly there for a lot of the stuff that gets covered. This dates back to the 70s up to 2007. So what's it like for me? This is a much more light-hearted writing style. It's a little bit sillier, but there's a respect for the developers and the games that they made and the skills and the challenges of the time. They have these categories here where they just break down all the games that are made by a certain developer, and you can see how over time they build up their experience and try new ideas, and it reminds me a lot of what the game UFO 50 was trying to emulate with a fictional developer on fictional hardware over a real decade. You start reading these and you start making a mental map of, well, I know 92 because I've seen some of the other stuff in this issue that came out in 92. They have some sort of quirky bits, like here it's all the games with Tingle from the Legend of Zelda series, because why not? Obscure hardware that you probably don't remember. That's cool to see. They talk a wee bit about it and they even tell you a game that's probably worth checking out on it. And in a similar story to PC Gamer, we've got in-depth coverage of games here, going and finding developers and chasing them down and getting the full story about how it was made, what they were going for, what the significance was after it released, what was the game's fate, the developer, all those kind of things. This reminds me of highly edited, well-written YouTube videos. Games don't release in a vacuum, right? They exist in the context of the time that they're in. What was the platforms available at the time? What did people expect from games? What was going on then? When you're not in that time, or maybe you didn't experience it yourself, or you don't remember it, this sort of writing is brilliant for giving that full picture. For example, here, 5 Ways Thief changed the game. So it's things like the light mechanic, the way the audio reverberates off of walls, which we take for granted now. That's everywhere. It's easy enough to go back and play a game, but it's not easy to understand what it meant at the time. I think there's a richness to that. The writers even talk about their own personal experiences with the games, and I think this gives it a much more personable element. You kind of get an idea for the different tastes and preferences of these writers. How about this one, about this game called The Seventh Guest? I'm not too familiar with it, but it's an FMV era title with a cool little trick of making them ghosts, because then they could be superimposed into 3D environments, and it didn't look too unfitting. Very clever stuff. What I didn't know is that, quote, this demo immediately attracted a stunned crowd, including Roberta Williams, who was so overwhelmed by the demo that she took off again, only to return a few minutes later with some of her developers, pointing at the monitor and shouting, I told you it was possible, and you wouldn't believe me. History is a vault waiting to be mined, right? There is so much that I just have no comprehension of. How about the Conix multi-system? This was meant to be a British games console and it never released. We never saw it. The funny thing is I've now gone back into old gaming magazines and it turns out, yeah, there was tons of hype for this thing. In fact, there was a mixture of people saying it's going to be a revolution for games and others who were annoyed at the amount of hype that was going on saying this will be a flop. There's no way that this could beat the Japanese and American offerings. There's a respect for the history here that I can't help but appreciate. Half of what I do on my YouTube channel is digging through history. I mean, I wouldn't be able to do half of what I do without the Internet Archive. Seeing it done by people who've been there and have seen it for a long time and they've spoken to many people across the industry really helps to give you the proper appreciation of the games industry. The big advantage that I think Retro Gamer have is that they're mostly writing on an era with smaller teams of developers, with games from companies that don't necessarily exist anymore, games that were drafted up with NDAs that maybe weren't the most thorough if they existed at all, and so they can talk quite freely. And you get some wild stories. There's tales of, oh, they wanted me to do a conversion of this game to a home computer, but I didn't have access to it, so I went into the arcade and I just held a camera up to the screen, and that was the basis, so that I rebuilt the game based on the footage. Absolutely insane things to come out of it, right? There's something to be said about the richness of having direct interviews, going right to the source and asking about how it was. It's not something you get unless you have the liberty and time to go out and speak to somebody, edit down an interview, incorporate it into a piece of writing, but you get pieces that you wouldn't get otherwise. They talk about the rooftop chase in Beyond Good and Evil, and there's a quote here. Here is a little secret I can share. This sequence is inspired by The Matrix, and I invite anyone interested to compare the chase sequence with the beginning of the film. These are the kind of things, the insights that you can't get from just necessarily looking at it and making the judgments yourself. Or you have this interview with David Wise, the composer who worked on games like Donkey Kong Country. And he was asked, why did you leave Rare? Obviously there was an accumulation, but there was one particular event. We were working on the Kinect and we were doing a bowling game, and it just took a lot more jumping through hoops to get anything done. It wasn't quick anymore. Not far from Rare, there was an empty disused bowling alley, and I got permission from the owner to take my mics down there and record all of the sound effects, and it just never got signed off. I mean, I could have spent 2 days down there and got it done quite quickly. The discussion about a Microsoft-owned game development studio and being so frank about the challenges and the problems that they were facing at the time, and your reasons for leaving the team as a result, I think the distance in time makes that possible. And I do wonder, now that we're in a period where there are large development teams, there are mega companies that keep on going even if they get sold on to the next organization, are people going to be at the same liberty to talk about games that we see from this era? I mean, I'd hope so. I think this magazine is really good at sparking curiosity, making you think about games that you didn't think about in a certain way, finding new ones that you've never heard about that are apparently really important, but you just weren't in the right time, right place to see it. It's amazing to be able to then go and explore things because, well, I've read them in here. And that's Retro Gamer. Edge magazine. If I were to describe the writing style of this one, I would say they're quite serious, a little bit drier, but very analytical. If you like your deep dives and your insightful analysis, this is probably the one to go to. We've got sound bites from people in the industry, which are always a strange mix of insightful and absolutely insane. We've got information on the wider world about what different groups and organizations are doing to encourage game development, for example. We've got our same preview section that you might recognize from PC Gamer, but here the taste is a little more niche. They will cover big releases, Metaphor ReFantazio for example, but They also give a lot of space for indies. Rise of the Golden Idol looks brilliant. I love the first game. Really looking forward to this one now. Then we've got our big main feature of the magazine. This time it's Dragon Age the Veilguard. And when you consider that a lot of the online discussion of this game was mired in a lot of bad faith arguments, right? But a lot of the discussion was dominated by people who make snap judgments based on things that, honestly, they probably don't care enough about. The story is rarely ever just developers are lazy, right? Because if that was the case, gaming would be a boring place to be in. When you read a good article like this, you understand where they're coming from. You can start to think about, well, what went right, what went wrong. And it's often a lot more nuanced than just making snap judgments from reading a headline. I really like the level of professional insight that Edge offers. So there's this discussion here where you have a Q&A section with the art director, and he talks about how now, with it being such a visual medium as well, with so many art assets and a large world to create and those kind of things, you need the art team to also be at the table early on, and it's been an uphill battle getting to that point. These collected works segments are brilliant, effectively charting a creative story through the games that they've released. It makes complete sense. In this case, Yoshiro Kimura, the most interesting thing I would say is this point from working in the early days on games and being thrust into the roles of responsibility, leading up to the finishing of Rule of Rose, at which point he took a step back. He actually thought, no, I'm not in a good position to be doing this, and took a break. And so you get his story of sort of working back up to that point, making the kinds of things he's more happy with and being happier overall with his creative output. These making of segments are similarly full of fascinating insights. There was a good article in one recent issue talking about the idea of co-dev. So rather than just support studios that come in and do miscellaneous piece of work, co-dev is more focused on working on entire chunks of games, right? So you work on one set of mechanics or one area of the map, and that gets handed over to another studio and they are responsible and manage that entire portion. I really enjoyed this one. What happens when multiplayer games are switched off for good? I mean, the last video I made was on The Crew, right? This is of interest to me. And seeing how it pans out for different games is, oh god, it makes you worried for the industry. And then, yes, towards the end of the magazine you have reviews. And these reviews are quite cutthroat. One of the things I really like with Edge is they have these postscript segments after some of their interviews. And during these they can kind of talk a little bit more off the record about general trends they're experiencing or what certain game releases represent for the industry. Here they talk about, for example, the use of static cameras and the way that an old technique used for games like the original Resident Evils is brought back intentionally and it's given new form. You might see it as a little bit stuffy. I've definitely read in other places references to Edge being the stuffy magazine, but if you're into this style of deeply analytical writing and you watch YouTube videos of the same style, this is a great fit. One of the benefits of covering the industry is that you get different perspectives. And actually, I've read things in here that I just don't agree with. There was an absolutely insane article. A lot of developers were asked about the industry's having issues right now. What would you do to resolve this? And a lot of the responses were great. It was things about making sure the scope and scale of projects is appropriate, having fallbacks, things that mean that developers don't just end up out on the street without a job when these kind of contractions happen after large investment periods. And then you had some ridiculous quote from like an executive saying, if great game design leverages virtual currencies and digital collectible property, we will have a legit metaverse or several of them. As everyone else on these pages is talking about losing their jobs. And actually, printing it back to back with all of these down-to-earth takes just without any words just makes you look a bit silly. On a bit of a nicer note, you could take this discussion with somebody who has got lots of experience in mobile games, and they do genuinely ask, you said that video games are a bit like an art form masquerading as a business. What do you think about the idea that mobile games are a business masquerading as an art form? And he actually does come out in decent defense here of mobile games. He talks here about how they have customer service actually reach out to people who are spending a lot of money and ask them, hey, you know, you're spending a lot. Is everything okay? And, you know, I don't think that's a perfect solution, but it is nice to see that, well, they've asked the difficult question and they've got an intriguing answer out of it. In general, I would say Edge is good for wider understanding of the industry and also covering some of the more niche things that you wouldn't know about otherwise. For example, I had no idea about this game, Eternal Strands, and actually, the description of it sounded really fun. There was a lot of discussion about physically simulating elements, so lots of physics objects, but also the temperature level, so a fire attack actually just increases the temperature of the area. Things like that, and it sounded great. So I bought it, and actually, yeah, I'm having a great time. So all three of these magazines are handled by Future Publishing, and as a result, they're all available physically and also digitally. So when I'm on public transport, I use the app, and this seems to be used for a lot of different magazines. But the premise is, go bang, I'm gonna open that, and it starts downloading it. And now I can read through the pages, and that's great. Nice and simple, you know, zoom in. It also lets you use it as a sort of like text reader, if I remember how. So the app's nice. It's not the most slick thing in the world, but it definitely gets the job done. And yeah, for example, you can go to the mobile version of the page, and then that just gives you a much more, you know, you scroll, and then you go, okay, next article. If you're on a limited size screen, it makes sense. I think the app is okay. It does what it needs to do. It's not the fanciest thing out there. But that's enough for the major magazines. Let's talk about something indie. This magazine is called Debug, and I found this from, I think I just googled what magazines were available in the UK. It's relatively recent. It's indie, so the magazine itself is independent, and so are the games it covers. And you can tell that it's at a different scale, because you can go on the website, go to the press kit, and they tell you what the circulation is, and it's 4,000. It's not a lot of people, but I'm one of them. So let's talk about it. This magazine has a bit of a different format. Because it's indie focused, it covers a lot of games. Every single game has a QR code, and you scan that and it takes you to the Steam page and you can go and wishlist it. And they do cover a lot of games. I would say the tone of this magazine is more wide-eyed optimism. There's a line here that I think covers their mantra pretty well. While the Day of the Devs demo of Horses is rough around the edges, it's certainly no less compelling after spending half an hour with it. Even if it doesn't sell millions of copies, the fact that radical games like this are still being published, not to mention being previewed in printed gaming magazines, is something worth celebrating. This is a different style of magazine. If you want your standard, normal coverage, this isn't necessarily that. This magazine works best when you have your phone off to one side and you're going to each page reading and thinking, oh, that sounds cool. Scan, wishlist, move on to the next thing. It's an amazing tool for getting games on my radar. It's nice to just pick up things that you would never have seen otherwise. They don't get a lot of attention. In particular, this preview sort of category works really well for this magazine. You get the idea of what the game is going to be, and then you can go and see what happens when it truly releases. I will admit, it's not as tightly written as, say, Edge or PC Gamer or Retro Gamer. Here's one example. It's just something small, but you can see the formatting on this page that this article kind of seems to end mid-sentence, but actually, the rest of it's just here. It also comes across occasionally in the writing. It maybe doesn't flow as well as you'd maybe think. So this paragraph here mostly just feels like sentences of like the same length describing elements of the game. Is there any problem with that? No, not really. Is this nitpicking? Yeah, definitely. Which leads me on to my main point with this one. I really like what it's going for, and I want to stress that I'm going to criticize it, knowing that it's independent. You know, it does rely on good word of mouth in order to get copies across. I think this is a good magazine. I do think there's things they can improve on. The first half, with previews and events happening in the area, and all these games that you can scan and wishlist, is excellent. It gives me an enthusiasm and an excitement for indie games to a level that I hadn't had before. The game developer diaries are a fun thing to have in writing. You get the sense each month of how things are going. I also really like some of the industry experience. People who work in promotion teams or publishers or anything like that. giving advice to indie developers about how to get their game made, get it out there. It's the portion in between I'm not crazy about. The reviews are okay. They're just okay. The scores feel quite arbitrary. Here's an example. This game, Earl 2, there's some banging music, you fight a variety of enemies, it takes a little bit to get into the groove of the controls, but it's pretty fun. A bit more feedback noise from getting a perfect hit, but this is definitely one to check out. 6 out of 10. That feels overly harsh. It feels in general like there isn't exactly a house scoring scheme. So for example, in the review section of PC Gamer, they actually explain the scoring system. Most of this I think comes down to them not having a lot of space. If you have to write your review of Planet Coaster 2, which is a relatively big release, and it did have some issues, how are you going to be able to cover that in such a small area? You have to be careful that it reflects the tone and the points made in the text. I actually think solution is to not give a score. Because yeah, there's a lot of different writers here. They're all going to have different opinions. It's a smaller operation as well, where they're not going to have a dedicated review scale that's been used for over a decade. And it would be nice if there was just a little more breathing room for that text, because it feels like a lot of the time you get to the description of what the game is, and then the review ends. This is in contrast to the previews earlier, which are effectively the same thing, but it's made up for by the general mantra of get these games out there so that you know about them, put them on your wish list, and it's a thing to get excited about. And I really like that, and I really want to support that. I'm a big fan of this magazine. One thing I really like, as a smaller magazine, Debug has to have community engagement in a sort of modern social media sense. And they really do take that to heart. You have these sections, these pages, where they actually ask people questions in the community and then they get into print. You do feel like you're part of that scene. It feels like an essential thing for, frankly, for survival, because these are the people who are keeping your passionate work, right, alive. So there's Debug. If you like indies, this is a really good one to check out. Also, subscribing to it doesn't give you an app to access these things, but you can go onto the website and download PDFs. It's not as convenient, but again, give it the scale, totally fine. Downloading a PDF, chucking it on my phone, to me it's the same difference. Now for something a little different. This is Patch. This is more of a zine, I'd say, given the size and also the amount of pages. Patch is a very laid-back zine. It's got a certain vibe, and you'll know almost immediately if that vibe is right for you. Generally, I'd say they've got a focus on indie games, and especially cozy games, but not across the board. That just seems to be the main type of coverage. I mean, for example here, this is a shooter. It's just relaxing. You're not going to get any existential crises from reading this, but you are going to get some more cool games, and from a slightly different sphere than might be covered in other places. And once again, I've found cool games like Mexico 1921, A Deep Slumber. This sounds cool. It's post-revolutionary Mexico, but it's carried a lot by the interesting setting and the interesting perspective, and that's my kind of thing too. As another independent work, I would say it's again not edited quite as tightly. The formatting is beautiful, but there are occasionally mistakes, just small little things. Here they talk about this talent company that has a lot of streamers under their wing, and they also recommend 10 content creators that we think you might like, which is nice. That sounds cool. That's a unique premise. However, that's not 10. I mean, it's still a good piece. It's just something small they didn't catch. This is a good interview, and when you look across these pages, you kind of realize that almost half of the space is dedicated to the questions. The questions are essential, but they don't have to be word for word. They can be shortened, especially if it means you can fit in more of the perspective into the interview. But I think the most important thing, right, once we get away from these small things, it's not that kind of magazine. This isn't the hard cutting edge journalism that you expect from a big 100-page monthly piece from a major publishing arm, right? This is a certain vibe, and it's really cool seeing that. Am I necessarily the audience for this one? Maybe not exactly. It's cool to see as a different sphere, a different world, right, outside of what I typically play. But I will say, I only have one of these on me. I do have two. I've already lent one to a friend. And I think that makes great evidence that there is an audience for this. They have these great articles towards the end, and I love these, where it's some silly thing to do. Okay, I'll give a good example. This one is making the keychains, right? Last issue's one was baking like a kind of cake based on, I think it was a Swedish one because it was a Swedish inspired game. That's really cool. That's really sweet. It feels like this is something where you can go and do this and have fun. This is where Patch really shines. This is what they're really, really good at. Whenever they go a little bit off the beaten path and do something a little unusual, it really works. Once again, they have a lot of community engagement. So again, it's cool seeing this community and this scene all built around something physical that you can get every month. I don't think there's any way to read this digitally. I think it's purely in physical print, and when I lent the other copy out to a friend, I did kind of want to check that issue for reference, talking here, and I couldn't really find any way of doing that, so if there's something that could improve, just like a PDF download on the website or something would be nice. Alright, let's get weird. This is, from my understanding, a revival of an old Commodore Amiga based magazine. So despite the concerns about, money's going out of games writing and there's less opportunities, it does seem like some of the things you don't expect still have an opportunity. And it is very inspired by classic magazines. I mean, look at the formatting. Though this is an enthusiast magazine for the Amiga, and I don't have an Amiga. So at times, I kind of understand how my parents feel when I talk to them about computers. Here we go. Apollo Computer have released the most powerful Amiga 1000 accelerator, compact flash storage, Super AGA, integrated flicker fixer, and OAO CPU. I don't know what that is. I know some of the words. I don't really understand how it all comes together. It sounds like it's good. This is cool. Yeah, this is another one you immediately know if this is for you. Let's talk about it from an outsider's perspective. This feels like raw passion for the material. I mean, there's an Amiga scene. I didn't know that. People are still making stuff for the Amiga. Look at all of these different groups around the UK that you can go to do Amiga stuff, like make games or talk about it, wherever. And they've all got like physical location addresses and websites. Some of them are just Facebook groups. I mean, passion comes through in all of these pages, like it's leaking out of the paper. The ink isn't actually, the print quality is very good, but issue 33 cover disc download. Use the link or QR below to download our cover disc. Oh, that's quite modern, that's cool. We've even included a free floppy label for subscribers. Obviously, you don't ship with a physical floppy disk, it just costs money, and if you're into Amiga stuff, you have tons of these floppies lying around. What you don't have is a label, so you end up with this weird quirk of, for our subscribers, you get, drum roll, a label. But that's cool. It tells you a lot about how things are shared in this scene. I don't know what this is advertising. Like, these are just things, doohickeys. I'm sure they do whatever they're supposed to do, and people are very happy about it. So how is the writing itself? Pretty good. It has a lot of the same strengths that Retro Gamer has, with good formatting, clearly years of experience going into the writing of these because it is an older scene, and also some interesting features, like this strange Amiga VR headset that I didn't know about, but looks utterly fascinating. Look at those graphics. And there's like multiple different units of different configurations. I'm definitely gonna see if I can find one of these in like a museum or something like that. The other cool thing is you again learn about what the Amiga scene was like, not just now, but back then. There's talk of, well, magazines. Of course, like if you want to learn about a system back then, pre-internet, you're probably gonna need to subscribe to a magazine. For example, here at code listings, so they would just put out the code, you'd copy it, write it into your machine, and then you'd end up with a game, if everything worked. Amiga Addict has a lot of personality, and I think that carries it a lot for somebody who isn't as in this scene as maybe most of the readers. I must mention the size of the game, as there are 7 worlds to explore, each containing a meaty 16 levels. That gives a total of, reaches for calculator, 112 levels? that can't be right. It is right, 112 levels. Just the way that's written is like, there's a fun lightheartedness there, and a passion and enthusiasm. They're genuinely impressed by that. So yeah, you're gonna know if this is for you, but it's been a very fun read for me. I did say we were getting weird. Okay, you know we were talking about the Amiga things that I found a little bit indiscernible? Well, put your skills to the test in the third pack of PNG bush strips. This is a very different demographic. And you can see here from a writing section where there's talk here about a very particular part of a very particular plane, and using a photo reference, so like, well actually, it's not totally accurate in the game. That's really cool. That's like proper enthusiast stuff. For a lot of people, they just have a computer for flight simulator. This is like World of Tanks or something like that, where people only play that game, and truly only play that game. And the way that you know that is when you look at the hardware upgrades, and you see that these rudder pedals are 340 quid. Or about this yoke for 430. Whew. But then, you know, isn't it something like the average guitarist who sticks with the hobby spends £10,000? So we're talking about planes that cost 15 quid being called good value because, hey, making super detailed planes, you need multiple people just to make it. That's not cheap. You have airports, and the airports come out at like 10 quid, they come out at 12 quid. This one passenger plane, which when I read the description, this is intricate. Like there is so much to this thing. 65 quid. But then you think about it, if you're into flight sims this much, you're probably going to get a game's worth of mileage out of this single passenger plane. That's the level of enthusiasm we're talking about here. Though I don't know how they get the storage space for these things. I mean, each of these planes and airports comes in at like 2 gigabytes. So you start downloading a whole bunch of them, you're going to need more than a terabyte of storage, I'll tell you that much. There we go. One jet, 1.6 gig. Overall, it's a really good magazine, covering the right kind of detail, the kind of small obsessive things that people who, you know, are going to dedicate a lot of time to this are going to want to care about. And yeah, in the world of gaming magazines, it's an interesting oddity. And here's our last one for today, Play Magazine, and I picked this up in a shop when I thought I should buy a few more to fill out the range of what I was going to talk about, only to discover it's the final issue. Yeah. So this is the descendant of PlayStation Magazine. They talk about what that legacy is here, and it ends. It ends here. I have to wonder. This is published by Future, again. So in the Future portfolio, prior to this final issue, you had both Edge and PC Gamer, which I would say possibly overlap into Play, but Play is strictly Sony focused. It feels like there maybe wasn't a space for it. And that's one of the problems with consolidation. It happens because the money starts going out of things. Future picks up Play at some point in the past, and at this point it's not compatible with what they offer. It's the consequence of this market pattern, so I'm not going to pin it on them. But they have shut down other magazines as well. For example, Games TM and Official Xbox Magazine have also been closed by them. This is just another one to add to that list. And hey, you know, it wouldn't be a big deal if it sucked, right? So why don't we read it? So there's a great opening section where each of the writers talks about their experience. Then you get to the actual magazine, the bit they were probably writing before they found out they were being shut down. And you know what sucks? I kind of like it. This is a really neatly organized magazine. I'd say kind of like Edge as well. Everything's just very clean. It's easy to know what order to read things in. Your eyes aren't jumping around the pages too much. They have this fun section about low poly horror that's really interesting. There's a talk through Silent Hill games, but specifically some of the Western ones that weren't as well received, and they talk to some of the developers. Yeah, this is the last single format magazine in the UK. And these were incredibly common. I talked about Amiga Addict, which I guess you could consider one, but for like a current console. And now this kind of bit of British magazine history is, well, ended. And it's a shame because these guys are funny. Why bother playing Payday 3 on PS5 Pro when the experience of simply buying one feels a lot like daylight robbery? Actually, that whole thing is applicable. because Payday 3, eesh. Well, that's a discussion for another time. And then in this issue, you also have genuinely one of the funniest reviews that I've ever read. Test Drive Unlimited Solar Crown. Massively disappointing for me purely because it's online only. There are a great many problems with this game, but let's start with the biggest. It's dull. It looks dull, it feels dull, the story's dull, and then this virtual recreation of Hong Kong, that city with a population of 7.5 million people, almost everyone's left town. You might glimpse people down closed off streets standing around in groups of 3 with their arms folded or hands on their hips, like they're earnestly discussing the alien swarm that's wiped out 99.99% of their kin. I'm taking this with no expectation. It sucks to see that personality and genuine enjoyment I got of this. And I can't get any more of it, but this is the way things are going. Let's not kid ourselves here. Money's going out of games writing. Advertising online isn't as lucrative as it used to be, and social media and search engine optimization has just decimated a lot of the writing. We've seen online sites with complete shift changes between teams where everybody's laid off and a cheaper crew put in their place. We see websites lose their unique features and interviews and these things that take time and money and effort in favour of quick, easy stuff to keep the lights on, like guides and Twitter reposts and press releases with no analysis. And honestly, it's because a lot of people just don't want to pay for their writing. And I get it. Growing up, it's not like I exactly had the money to go out and buy a physical game magazine if that money could go towards a game. But I spend so much time playing games, talking about games, and, well, making videos for them. This is a big part of my life and it's a huge hobby for me. I feel like it only makes sense that if I want good writing, I have to pay for it. And it's a shame because we were in a golden age of all this stuff was free, readily accessible, the period of growth with the internet, the Wild West period going into early social media, and everything was available, and it feels weird to go back to, this physical medium from bygone times. But there's a richness here that I haven't gotten from reading games in a long time. Social media made me a grumpy, angry person about games. This made me enthusiastic. The final word in this last issue of Play has such a baller quote. They talk about how there's a team here and they put in the effort and the passion together, bringing all that together to create a house style and produce something that comes out every month and people get to keep. They say here about physical media and how it's something websites don't really achieve. No one really has a connection to a Google searched hot take and you can't pull out a box of IGNs and have a moment of reflection. But the really baller quote is, when the final nail in print comes around and we're left with a void filled by interchangeable influencers, overly excitable VTubers, pick-me streamers, Twitch haters for clicks, and well, the internet, life, as someone who loves video games and has always been passionate about magazines, is going to feel smaller, less colourful, and just a bit sadder. I feel like I've come to this late. I feel like I can come in and say, well, here's some cool magazines to check out. I can come here and make easy statements like, this is the deep analytical one, this is the one if you like old stuff, this is the one if you want your mainstream current coverage, and cast it aside and move on with my day, and this stuff could disappear. As I was reading this, I was like, will they disappear? Will I be talking about magazines that don't exist anymore when I get around to doing this video? And well, I guess they kinda have. And the worst thing is I don't know if things will change. I don't know how you change it. Gamers are traditionally quite hard to part with their money, and there's a lot of young people who play games, and, well, if things get too expensive, they just move on to other things. I want to believe there's a space for this. It's just that people often don't pay for their writing, and I don't know where the money's coming from anymore. I had a whole thing about, let's talk about the price of it and do all those things. I'm not saying subscribe to all these magazines. I've done that for the sake of this video. Honestly, I might stay subscribed to all of them because I found I quite enjoyed them actually. I think the point is, there is a service being provided here, and if any of these appeal to you, it's probably worth going out and supporting that. Lots of good publications have paid online systems where you read everything digitally and articles come in daily. I really like the monthly format. I think the 24/7 stream of social media becomes overwhelming, and a lot of information just isn't important. A lot of the Twitter stuff of the world, right? I'm worried that in a few years, this video will be completely outdated and all of these things will be gone. And half of the reason I made this video was I feel like more people should know that, yeah, magazines do still exist. I know it's harder in America, but there's loads of independent options as well, even if the big titans have already left. A lot of newer magazines do distribute internationally, and that's because I think they're aware that there are countries where there just aren't options anymore. There are ones that work digitally as well, for exactly the same reason. I don't really have a good answer to this. I've come into this late, too young to be there when a lot of them started, and now that I am reading them, they're starting to go away. But I don't think it's doomed. I do think there's a space for these physical gaming magazines. I also think there's a space for good games writing. I just don't know what that's going to look like. Thanks for joining me.